So most people know by now that the Russia bridge connecting it to Crimea was blown up the other day, but I don't think a lot of people understand the magnitude of how badly this impacts Russia. This is a visual of the bridge, and this is where it would be in this spot right here. So I'm going to show you a clip from my favorite geopolitics expert on YouTube, because he does a phenomenal job explaining exactly how this is going to impact Russia.
Logistically, it is difficult to understate the criticality of this for the Russians. Russia doesn't have a road network. The money generated per acre of farmland is so low, because it's all short season wheat, that they've never built one. They've never been able to afford it. So if you want to move things at volume, you have to move them by rail.
The critical thing to understand about war is that transportation and speed of transportation is pretty much everything. If you can't move people and supplies from point A to point B quickly, you're done.
With Kerch being the only real connection, it is the primary way that the Russians supply Crimea and the southwestern front with not just troops and equipment, but with food and fuel. And that's for the civilian population as well. That is now all in question. Now, the Ukrainians have been...
That's an interesting thing to consider too, is that how are the citizens of Crimea going to handle this if they're undersupplied with food?
Wanting to hit this bridge since the beginning, but they have not been able to prove to the Americans that they can get trained up or be trusted with the long-range rocket systems that would be necessary to target something that's so reinforced and so distant. So they went old school and used a truck bomb.
That's pretty sick. It's like a Grand Theft Auto type of mission.
At the moment, damage assessments are still being done, but it is obvious that one of the two major road spans has been dropped. That is not the sort of thing you fix without several months of work. And they timed the explosion to blow up a fuel train that was going through, so the whole thing's on fire. We're talking about Russian troops in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson and Crimea suddenly being on their own. The Russians can only...
How do those guys hold up? The soldiers that are in Crimea, a place they took over in 2014, the big question is, how do the citizens feel about Russian occupation? Because if you have a cluster of soldiers there, undersupplied, with angry citizens, how does that play out?
We supply those three regions in two ways now. One is by truck. And we know that because of all the javelins that have been put into Ukraine and all the RPGs, that the Russians are almost out of their entire military tactical truck fleet, and they've started using city buses and Scooby-Doo vans. And those...
Yeah, that's not going to be sustainable. And that's the beauty of true capitalism. In America, if you have a need for something, it gets built. In Putin's corruption-filled monarchy, there's not as much incentive to build things that are needed because you don't always get properly compensated.
Just can't take the volume of stuff that an active frontline needs, and they're certainly far more vulnerable to disruption. The second option is ships. You do have major ports at Novorossiysk on the Black Sea.
Even if you can get around this, it's still detrimental because it's less than before. Like if they weren't thriving before when they had their railways squared away, it's going to be detrimental to lose one of their transportation options.
But if we're now in a situation where Kerch can't supply things like anti-aircraft missiles, anti-ship missiles, food, it's very easy to see the Ukrainians being able to repeat the feat that they did earlier this summer when they sunk the flagship, the Moskva, and do that to every single cargo ship that the Russians try to bring in.
See, now this is going to be such a bad situation for Russia, at least from what it looks like on the outside looking in, that my biggest concern is Putin lashing out in a violent nuclear way to Ukraine, at least, because they're chipping away at Russia's armor pretty meticulously from what it sounds like. And if Russia gets into a situation where they're just bled out and Putin's embarrassed, what's going to happen?
Losing cargo ships in that volume, losing trucks and buses in that volume, is hollowing out the entirety of the Russian internal transport system. This is the sort of thing that if you bleed this fast, it takes a decade to recover from. And in a war zone, that is not going to happen, particularly since we're in an environment of sanctions where people are getting more and more skittish about selling the Russians anything.
Yeah, so point of all this, from the facts that are available to us, it looks like Russia's in terrible shape, but we always knew that they were going to have a hard time doing what they want to do with the full resources of NATO at Ukraine's disposal. The wild card in all this is how crazy is Putin willing to get with the most deadly weapons they have. We have to hope that there's some way out of this, whether it's a peace deal or an agreement. I know all the politicians are getting mad about the idea of letting Russia keep some land in Ukraine, but if we make a deal where they get to keep a part of the eastern parts of Ukraine, keep the sanctions on them for a while, it's better than a nuclear situation of any kind. Let me know what you think, though.